Story 1. It will either talk about him as a coup leader attempting to overthrow American democracy or as the father of the United States, a great thinker and leader, and how he was the best golfer the world has ever seen. Story 2. I think they will remember him as the president who accelerated the decline of the United States of America. Story 3. The most corrupt president in the history of the United States. Story 4. There will be no history taught if he gets his way. Story 5. If he had just had one term, the discussion would be neutral, perhaps focusing on polarization and warning signs, but mostly glossed over as a generally ineffective, nominally unpopular president who struggled to have a lasting impact once he entered retirement. Even January 6th would have been reflected on as an embarrassment the country moved past, but not more than that. Now that he is in his second term and involved in many significant events, it really depends on who writes the history books. Either way, he is now one of the most influential presidents in our history and will have an entire chapter or more devoted to him. Story 6. They will critique him harshly, but they will vilify the American people for sitting around doing nothing to fight against fascism. Deservedly so. History will not be kind to us. We do not deserve it. We are like 1933 Germans. That is who we are and what this country has become. Story 7. I hope it will say, the president that nearly destroyed the United States of America, instead of, the president that completely destroyed the United States of America. Story 8. He was the only president to suspend the Constitution and rule by decree, the first president impeached more than once, the first convicted felon elected president, the only president to incite an act of violence and insurrection against the United States. Story 9. It turns out a well-informed citizenry was the best defense against tyranny. Quod erat demonstrandum. Story 10. College history books and most high school textbooks describe him as a corrupt right-wing authoritarian and refer to it as America's experiment with fascism. Texas school history books, however, state that he saved the country. Story 11. The history books in most schools will be able to tell the truth by then. They will not be favorable to him and his followers. Story 12. I remember growing up and learning in history class about how Ulysses S. Grant's administration was extremely corrupt. His cabinet was ineffective and self-serving, but he was elected largely for his popularity as a war hero. I believe Donald Trump will surpass Grant in discussions about corrupt administrations and the dangers of replacing public servants with public figures. Story 13. The hardest working president ever. No president could do better. His numbers were huge. Story 14. He will likely play a major role at the beginning of the chapter about the decline and eventual collapse of the United States of America. Story 15. What will be unusual is when students need parental permission slips to participate in the history class section about Donald Trump. Topics include adult film actors, derogatory terms for countries, controversial statements, the Access Hollywood tape, and other related content. Story 16. My hope is that his rise will lead to advances in democracy that prevent anyone like him from ever holding public office. Story 17. He will be known as the most inept and corrupt president ever, and will go down in history as an example of what can happen when commentators promote disinformation without legal consequences. The positive outcome of his presidency will be a lesson for history. Story 18. At this rate, will we have accurate history books? Story 19. The outcome depends on how long conservatives retain power. If they maintain control of the Supreme Court and Congress, school history books may be required to portray Donald Trump positively rather than accurately. Story 20. It will be debated whether he was more like Nero or Caligula, the worst Roman emperors. Story 21. He is the reason the United States of America became hated by the rest of the world. Story 22. Do you think there will be history books in United States schools in 50 years? Story 23. I think it will be the same as how we look back at similar openly corrupt criminals in office. They will say, how could this have happened? Why did not anyone stop him? Never again. Meanwhile, people supporting and working in the Donald Trump administration will still be alive, still in politics, still trying to destroy lives, and still facing no consequences of any kind. Story 24. It is uncertain. Florida's history books in schools now state that enslaved people were given a great opportunity by learning many trades and skilled labor, and they are better off because of it. Thank you, DeSantis. Story 25. Well, given that supporters of Donald Trump are writing the history books, they will describe it as a legendary fight between good and evil where good won the day with Donald Trump shielding the world. It will speak kindly of him. Story 26. I almost hope they just leave it out. It is apparent that discussing Adolf Hitler and the National Socialist German Workers' Party in school taught half of us nothing. Story 27. At this rate of societal decline, in 50 years, books will be a quaint memory for people over 60 years old. If they have managed to survive measles, chickenpox, Escherichia coli, malnutrition, and fighting for everything else. Story 28. Worst president in the history of our country, corrupt and a criminal. Story 29. I do not care what they say in the future. How do we convince supporters of former President Donald Trump today that he is ruining the country? Story 30. He will be noted as the first president of the United States of America. Story 31. Option 1. The books will say that American democracy almost failed under his administrations. Option 2. American democracy failed, and the books will say he was the best president ever. Story 32. Donald Trump suffered a cardiac arrest on September 7, 2025. Story 33. Moron, corrupt, pedophile, fat, lazy, cheats at golf, cankles. Story 34. When the files were released after his death, it turned out he was a predatory child molester. Story 35. Sadly, we will probably continue to have even worse presidents. I remember growing up, people saying we could not do worse than George W. Bush, and now there is nostalgia for him because Donald Trump is so unwise and terrible. Story 36. It is what they say about us that concerns me. An absolute ignorant self-serving buffoon was elected twice, even after telling everyone he was planning a dictatorship and, by the way, Plan 2025 that would destroy the federal government and reboot America back to 1780. What does that say about the decline of America? Story 37. Outside of America, Russia's compromising of the United States presidency ushered in an era of fascism and led directly to the fall of America on the world stage and the end of their superpower status. Story 38. Better yet, what will it say about his supporters? And what will their family stories say about themselves? I wonder how much bias will be passed down through generations. Story 39. Without political slants. A sexual predator admitted this in multiple interviews. A pimp bragged about the highest contract with Playboy for his then-wife Barbie Benton to pose. She did not want to, but this was when men made the decisions for their wives. He forced her to use her body for the sexual gratification of thousands of other men. This is the definition of a pimp. A con man, Trump University, ring a bell? A failed businessman several times over. He bankrupted a casino, a near-legal way to print money, and he bungled it. Repeatedly unfaithful to his wives. He freely admits it. Father of multiple children outside marriage. He fathered 3 of his 5 children outside the marriage, divorcing his wife to marry the affair partner. Still, children created outside the marriage. A convicted felon 34 times over. Sadly, no prison time. Twice impeached. May have remained in office, but that does not change the fact he was impeached twice. Story 40. I hope it says the army arrested him and his family and they all died in Guantanamo Bay. Story 41. The most fascinating thing is not Donald Trump himself, but how all facets of the United States have collapsed and bowed to authoritarianism. Congress, the courts, the media, corporations, including the previously liberal technology industry, educational institutions, museums, influential actors and musicians, and the population as a whole. It turns out that the whole idea about Americans loving freedom to an extreme degree was false. They were just memes. Nobody was thinking about the words they were saying. They did not mean anything. That was the nation's entire identity, and it has been entirely destroyed. The United States has no identity now. Its soul has been ripped out, and now its body is being stripped for parts. I truly do not think the United States will survive the Trump presidency. There will be some kind of revolution, and a new constitution will be written. It is a more remote possibility, but there is an outside chance the country could even split. Story 42. History is written by the victors, so it depends on whether he wins or loses. Story 43. In what is now known as the American Soviet Republic, formerly known as the United States of America. Story 44. Internationally, he will be rightfully depicted as the one who caused the empire to fall, like a very foolish and inept Romulus Augustulus. Story 45. They will be more judgmental of the people who elected him twice. Story 46. Hopefully they say nothing. It sums up all the positive things he has done for humanity. Story 47. He is the greatest and smartest president ever and definitely does not have a small penis. Story 48. It depends on whether history is still allowed in 50 years. Story 49. The history books will note this as the first American dictatorship and the death of democracy. Story 50. It depends on what they will teach the children at young pioneers or youth camps. Story 51. Hopefully he has forgotten to the same extent as Calvin Coolidge. College-level American history and little else. Story 52. Either that he was America's first fascist leader, or he is the supreme leader who brought about the Golden Revolution and Trump dynasty. There is no in-between. Story 53. Book title: The Narcissistic Clown Years, The Grueling Times of the Worst President in American History. Story 54. If your people do something about it, there will be no history books. Story 55. They will have many documentaries on the History Channel. Story 56. It depends on which country's history book you are reading. Donald Trump and his administration are already openly trying to interfere with what history is taught and how it is taught. Do not expect American textbooks to be honest if he gets his way. Story 57. Based on his environmental policies alone, he will be remembered as the person most responsible for the slow destruction of the earth and humanity itself. The most damaging individual who ever lived. Story 58. How about 1,000 years from now? We are living through world-changing events that will be studied for millennia. Story 59. We will have two different history books: blue state history books and red state history books. Story 60. I hope the Trump presidencies marked the start of the darkest age for the American democratic experiment. I expect the great and glorious Donald Jonathan Trump, the greatest person to have ever lived, descended from heaven to bring us into a glorious age of enlightenment. Now back to the zinc mines, citizen. Story 61. Bold of you to assume people will be able to read in America 50 years from now. But pending his imminent removal, it will say what they say now. He is a mushroom-dicked rapist, pedophile, Nazi, cuck puppet narcissist who will do anything to have people forcibly say they like him. He is also a convicted felon and a genuine piece of garbage surrounded by pieces of garbage voted into power by criminals and uneducated people claiming Christianity as an excuse to be even more vile. Story 62. There will be more about him in joke books than in history books. Story 63. History will judge Donald Trump as one of the most successful con men in history. He will also be known as a world-class child abuser. Story 64. We have to have some sort of opposition party. Democrats certainly are not interested. Story 65. It will be just like the Bioidentification and Forensics Facility Museum in Back to the Future. Story 66. Accelerated the end of an empire and supported a genocide. I suspect the Holocaust that Israel is committing will last through the ages. Many United States presidents will serve in the next 50 years. Donald Trump will be forgotten in time. Story 67. He was targeted by deep state infiltrators and the Democratic Party stole the 2020 election. The so-called coronavirus pandemic was designed to disrupt the election and economy. Hopefully by then all of the corrupt politicians like Barack Obama, Joe Biden, and others will be seen as what they are, traitors. It is also likely that Donald Trump will be considered a politician who puts America first. Story 68. It will not be about who writes the books. It will be about who is allowed to read them. Based on the book purging that has been occurring in many states in schools and libraries, many people will never be exposed to the truth. Story 69. Historians now agree that he is the worst president of the United States ever. Story 70. Serving two non-consecutive terms is quite rare in history. It is probably similar to Reagan. Many people hated him and many loved him. Having a healthy opposing party is a good thing. I am not a fan of him or his policies. However, 49% of the country disliking their leaders is a healthy democracy by definition. Story 71. There will be entire undergraduate degrees devoted to the Trump years offered by post-secondary history programs in the future. Story 72. What people say about him now, worst president in history. Story 73. Get a load of this guy. He thinks civilization will still be around in 50 years. Story 74. It is not going to matter because at this rate, who will be able to read by that point? Story 75. I do not know. What do the Democratic People's Republic of Korea history books say about Kim Il-sung? Story 76. He did nothing to help the Gulf South when they faced a Category 6 hurricane in 2026 and used it to push martial law and cancel the 2026 midterm elections. Story 77. There may not be history books in the future, only fictional propaganda. Consider what he plans to do to the Smithsonian. Story 78. I wish it would be nothing, but if we cannot have that, the truth would be nice. A completely corrupt, pedophile, con man, person who made the world a much worse place. Story 79. He tried to jumpstart United States manufacturing by imposing a tax on companies importing goods, which raised the price of all goods in the country and caused a depression because no one could afford the goods. Story 80. They will discuss how obvious and evident the corruption was, and how the Republican Party continued to double down each time since they decided that their feelings do not care about facts. Story 81. The chiseled, strong-handed figure depicted in the mighty golden statues in every town square in the United States of America and on all American currency was sent by divine forces to fight alongside noble corporations to save our land from evil hordes. Hail America! Hail America! Hail America and its golden corporations! Please proceed to the Tesla and ExxonMobil coal mines. Remember, those who do not collect their daily quota will not be allowed their weekly ration of fried chicken. Story 82. Single-handedly ruined Reddit for the majority of non-American users. Story 83. What will Republicans say about him in 10 years is a better question. They will all say they did not like him and only voted for him to stop Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden. Story 84. The same way all individuals guilty of child sexual abuse are remembered, no matter what else they have done, as a child sexual abuser. Story 85. More to the point, what will be said about those who voted for him? Story 86. That America temporarily forgot the collective social norms that guided the country through the last 100 years. Story 87. They will say that he was the most profoundly dishonest and openly corrupt president in United States history, that he did not mind harming our country and its future for anything that benefited himself, and that he helped really bad people get into positions of power who were just using his popularity to secure their financial and political dominance. Story 88. Unsure. However, I believe the words corrupt and corruption will be used frequently. Story 89. He was a horrible person, rapist, felon, cheater, and liar. Story 90. I hope something about how he is an orange-painted jumper with the emotional and intellectual maturity of a frog. Story 91. Honestly, not as bad as you probably think. How dare I? Because I remember Bill Clinton being hailed as the new Messiah and George W. Bush as the worst evil Satan that ever lived. It has not even been 50 years, and now people criticize Clinton while some think George W. Bush was not that bad for his handling of September 11th. Barack Obama, another man who seemed like a saint, had a tendency to use drone strikes in foreign countries. So even his halo is tarnishing. History has a way of flattening greatness to mediocrity. Story 92. There must be 1,000 books already written about how terrible he is. It is still incomprehensible that the words President of the United States and Donald Trump could be in the same sentence. Time and distance will not be kinder. Story 93. Probably write about him like Napoleon invading Russia in the middle of winter. Story 94. That he is the modern-day Caligula who accelerated American decline as a global power. Story 95. In 50 years, all books will be burned, and all digital content will be controlled by the Christian fascist state. Story 96. And thus began the fall of liberty and justice for all. Story 97. Everyone who worked under him is going to cash out and write their tell-alls. I knew it was wrong the whole time. I was shocked. Story 98. At this point, I think he will be written about in the same fashion as Benito Mussolini. There are many parallels. Story 99. It was later proven that his team rigged 3 elections and still lost the second one. Many more women came forward after his passing to report abuse of all kinds. People he contracted for work were compensated for what he owed them. The following administration reversed almost everything the president did while in office. Story 100. Someone will make a big mistake and forge a set of journals like the Hitler Diaries in the early 1980s. They will quickly be discredited when everyone remembers the person could not read or write. Story 101. I cannot see the United States staying together as it is now if the Make America Great Again supporters keep getting their way. Donald Trump will probably be known as the instigator of the breakup of the Union. Story 102. It is optimistic to think there will still be history books in 50 years. My prediction is that the climate crisis and nuclear war will dominate. Story 103. If evaluated by unbiased historians, he is often portrayed similarly to dishonest promoters. During both his first and second terms as president, he spent more time golfing than any other president, used his position to enrich himself and his family, and covered up many sexual predators, employing and pardoning them. He was the most authoritarian American president in history, with the most unqualified people in his cabinet, who acted according to his wishes rather than what was best for the country and its people. Story 104. Hopefully it is not written by the people currently in power so the truth can be told. Story 105. Hopefully the American people came to their senses, grew tired of his nonsense, and sent him on a one-way trip to Mars. Story 106. As far as American textbooks go, it depends on how this all turns out. However, there are plenty of other countries with history books, and many of them will write the history of Donald Trump as he deserves to be written, as a total fascist. Story 107. That is assuming there is a planet to write a history book about in 50 years, does it not? Story 108. I am not sure there will be history books 50 years from now. Story 109. One will talk about him conducting a coup on United States democracy. Story 110. One day he suddenly disappeared. He walked into a room at the White House, closed the door, and never came out. Story 111. I think the real point of the study will be on his supporters. Make America Great Again is indeed a cult. Story 112. He started his dictatorship by sending out troops to his own states under the guise of crime control and immigration aid to immigration and customs enforcement. Much like Adolf Hitler, it began small, inch by inch, then grew out of control. The people just sat back and watched. Story 113. People will question if what he did was true, so unbelievable, and how he got away with this in a democracy. He is also considered the worst president ever. Story 114. Donald Trump will be the reason our Constitution must be overhauled and updated to protect against mental illnesses. Story 115. If written correctly and accurately, they will say he was a tyrant. Story 116. Hopefully, they will show how unwise it is to vote for a billionaire with no experience to run the United States. Story 117. Notable fascist and failed dictator Donald Trump's headstone now holds the world record for most acts of disrespect on one person's grave. Story 118. I really hope they will describe him accurately with a full accounting of his crimes, but it is frequently hard to be that optimistic about it. Story 119. A cautionary tale of how delicate assumptions about the pillars of society can be. A society is only as strong as its current leader. No laws can prevent this from happening, only a profound moral compass and the will of unity to create a better future. Story 120. It will be like how we study Nazi Germany. Donald Trump is just the spokesperson who can talk well at rallies and people like him. He is important but not the ultimate authority. It is the people beneath him making and setting the policies who will be studied as the ones who brought the far right into power in the United States of America. Story 121. Donald J. Trump, God's second and most favored son, who he actually spared from execution, is the eternal president of the United States of America. He rode a majestic unicorn into battle against all of mankind's enemies and defeated them most greatly, as the prophecies foretold. Story 122. One of the worst presidents ever and the greatest internal threat to our government since the Civil War. They will also do their best to tell others not to allow this to happen again. However, 100 years after that, people will likely forget and raise a person like Donald Trump to power again. Story 123. Worst president in history. Poor experiment. No experience. Dishonest, deceptive, made decisions that benefited himself. Story 124. Largest cover-up of an elite pedophile ring that was openly operating and had been previously exposed. The co-head of the organization only received house arrest but can otherwise live life as normal. Story 125. The final nail in the coffin for the United States' global supremacy, similar to the Soviet Union's last president, in my opinion. Story 126. It took a while, but the Confederacy finally got their win. The South are really sore losers. Story 127. The greatest existential threat to our democracy since the Civil War. Story 128. There will not be any books. They will be banned for being too progressive. Story 129. I do not believe history will be kind to him. At least that is my hope. Story 130. By then, the country will have a different name. One of his grandchildren will be in charge. There will be places for his followers to gather, with harmful and unacceptable practices occurring occasionally. Such actions are illegal and unethical. Story 131. I think history will see Donald Trump as one of the most polarizing presidents ever. Some people will remember him for shaking up the system and appointing judges. Others will remember him for January 6th and the way he challenged democratic norms. Either way, he probably will not be a neutral figure in the history books, but rather a symbol of how divided America was during his time. Story 132. President Trump survived an assassination attempt during his second campaign. He was a divisive figure, with people either supporting or opposing him. He authorized major cuts to government agencies. He secured the border, though some disagreed with his methods of deportation. Depending on whether he ends the Ukraine war, he may be credited with ending the Russia-Ukraine conflict. This will likely be the extent of his legacy. Considering presidents from 50 years ago, unless one specifically studies history, most people only know one or two major actions they took. Story 133. If truth be told, he will be documented as the worst president in our history. Story 134. That depends on whether democracy falls or withstands this major test. Story 135. I think his plot to overthrow the government after he lost to Joseph Biden will be the major focal point of his presidency in history books. Story 136. Hopefully there is a dedicated section at the Smithsonian for Donald Trump and how he was the most corrupt president of the United States in American history and ushered in American fascism. There should be a domestic terrorist wall with all the January 6th names. Perhaps a similar display for all the Republican enablers in Congress. A special section for Mitch McConnell corrupting the Supreme Court of the United States. Story 137. A drug-addicted con man, racist, sexist, felon pedophile started a cult that voted him in as president who used American democracy to steal, lie, cheat, and grift his way out of impeachment while trying to be a dictator. Story 138. Between rising authoritarianism, climate change, and artificial intelligence, I cannot imagine history books will exist in any real form. Story 139. If the Make America Great Again supporters get their way, the former president will be portrayed as the second coming of George Washington and Abraham Lincoln multiplied tenfold. Story 140. He will be the worst president in history 50 years from now, 150 years from now, and 250 years from now. Story 141. History books will not exist 50 years from now. We are heading into the Dark Ages. Story 142. I think the focus will be on how the people have allowed it to come that far. Story 143. Failed aspiring dictator who managed to tank the global economy and ultimately isolated the United States for years to come. Story 144. People still revere Richard Nixon. Tyrants and their admirers are not going to change. There are still Nazis in Germany. Story 145, bad things. Very bad things. Of course, that assumes the fascists are not still in charge of the history books. Story 146. Time to reread the ending of Fahrenheit 451 and choose a book. Story 147. What history books? What books? If this administration is allowed to continue through the current term without immediate reversals of much of what they are doing now, there will not be any books. Unless they pass the Project 2025 evaluation. Story 148. It will not matter, we will not be able or allowed to read by then. Story 149. If books are not banned in 50 years, there will be many books explaining how Donald Trump and Jeffrey Epstein were the most famous pedophiles of all time and how it formed the basis of the Guardians of Pedophiles. Story 150. I was one of the first people who was arrested for desecrating his grave. Story 151. Other countries will remember him as a fascist dictator who destroyed democracy. Story 152. If we do not get rid of this group, there will be no history books in 50 years. Probably no books at all. Story 153. President Donald Trump reversed the American Cold War victory by working with Vladimir Putin to undermine the integrity of the United States government while ignoring the Constitution. The citizens did not realize what was happening. Story 154. The way things are going, who says we will still be around? Story 155. In 50 years, in 2075, he will be remembered as the person who caused the most damage to the environment through his policies and contacts. In 2045, it is forecasted that the oceans will be so acidic that up to 90% of all marine life will be lost. The year 2030 was supposed to be the deadline for limiting global warming. The sea level forecast for 2050 predicts at least 1 foot of rise, which will affect much of Louisiana, Florida, and other coastal states. The projections for 2060 to 2080 show no signs of slowing. I am not saying he is the sole cause, he definitely is not, but the predicted results of his environmental policies will be catastrophic. By 2075, people will likely hold him accountable for rolling back environmental protections for profit in 2025, when the focus should have been on saving the planet. He rolled back 145 rules protecting the environment in the first 100 days of his second term. He wants Greenland because it will be a massive resource if it melts. Presumably, he is also interested in Canada and the Northwest Passage for the same reason. Therefore, in 2075, he will likely be viewed as one of the biggest enablers of global heating. Story 156. In the most armed country in the world, the people sat back and watched it happen. The right to bear arms, unfortunately, does not come with bravery or a sense of morality. Story 157. Trumpism and Make America Great Again will be spoken about like we talk about McCarthyism today if American democracy survives. To the rest of the world, him and us are already a giant joke. Story 158. The responses here are hilarious for many reasons. I will give a significant example of why he probably won't be spoken about poorly. The George W. Bush administration lied to Congress multiple times about the following. 1. Iraq having weapons of mass destruction. This led to the United States invading Iraq, countless deaths, and the destabilization of the Middle East. 2. The torture programs at Guantanamo Bay and Abu Ghraib. We actually committed war crimes here, real war crimes that violated the Geneva Convention. 3. The National Security Agency surveillance programs, spying on U.S. citizens, which has many implications and was proven correct because of Edward Snowden. 4. The administration's neglect that caused the September 11th attacks to happen. Refer to the September 11th Commission report. Additional issues include 1. The September 11th attacks happened under this administration at the very least due to neglect. 2. The invasions in the Middle East. 3. Bush and Cheney gained a lot of wealth from the wars, see oil and Halliburton. 4. The administration closed with the 2008 financial crisis. 5. The Bush administration made many other mistakes, and Cheney and Bush could arguably be considered actual war criminals. France was extremely angry with the United States over our actions in the Middle East, so much that we started calling French fries freedom fries for a time, and travel advisories were issued for France. 6. Epstein's first case actually happened during the Bush administration, and he was given a huge plea deal. Let that sink in since it is relevant now. This was under Bush's Department of Justice. 7. Also, the expansion of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act courts. My point is objectively that George W. Bush did worse than anything Donald Trump has done, and people will comment on this post with insults because they forget things very easily. This is not a pro-Trump post. It is a statement about who the actual worst president was in recent American history, and perhaps all of United States history, and there is a lot to back that up. However, even if you think Trump is the worst, I can almost guarantee you, and this happened with Richard Nixon, you will have someone come along who makes you forget about Trump. So what do you think is going to happen to Trump? Story 159, he was a fascist cult leader, similar to those of the Axis nations in World War II, whose citizens eventually realized they had been repeatedly deceived. God help us in the next few years. Story 160. I think the United States will look upon the Trump years as Germany looks upon the Nazi years. Something went horribly wrong, and care must be taken that it never happens again. Story 161. The rules that were supposed to prevent all of this were, all along, much more akin to gentlemen's agreements with absolutely no real protection of any kind. This is when textbooks explain the process of impeachment and how being impeached does not mean automatic removal. A corrupt Senate has to allow the process to finish, which they have never done. Not even once. Textbooks will point out that Donald Trump is the only president to have been impeached twice so far. Story 162. Outside of the United States, he is considered the next iteration of Benito Mussolini and Adolf Hitler. In the United States, access to history books may be limited. Story 163. If we are lucky, they will describe him as both the worst person to ever be president and the very worst president ever. Story 164. It is bold to assume history books will be allowed 50 years from now, or any books at all, or that we will still be here. Story 165. He is a rapist, a pedophile, a con artist, a coward, a liar, and an idiot. Story 166. If you look at Russia, they have fake elections for show, but Vladimir Putin will always win. The Republican Party is doing the same. I do not believe we will have real elections again, and our history will be rewritten. Our history books will say what the Republican Party wants them to say, and they will still be in control. They are not planning on giving up power. Story 167. I think the most fascinating part, aside from his rampant authoritarianism, is how painfully unintelligent he is. He only has a basic understanding of how most things work and is unable or unwilling to learn. I suppose that is also his narcissism on full display, claiming he knows more about everything than anyone. History books will show his ignorance, and everyone will wonder how we got here and allowed him to get away with everything. Story 168. They will talk more about the cult movement that fell for his deception completely. Story 169. That presupposes that history books will still be legal if Donald Trump leaves office. Story 170. As usual, American history books will whitewash, also known as the United States is the greatest country spin, this sordid era of United States history. Of course, we are assuming that the United States survives the current fascist regime. There is no way that Americans would want to be reminded or actually learn from their own mistakes. Story 171. The threshold question is what will be said about the American electorate in 50 years. Story 172. There are going to be coloring books. No one will be reading anymore. Story 173. The first openly criminal president of the United States. Story 174. What do you think the history books in North Korea say about Kim? If Donald Trump has his way, we are headed to a place not too far from that. It is very likely that even though most of the citizens will know the truth, the books will say something very different. Story 175. No one will know how to write in the United States in 50 years based on current educational trends. Story 176. Bold of you to assume that anyone will be around to read them or know how to read anymore. Story 177. There will be no history books and no one who could read them if there were. Story 178. Do not worry. The history books of other countries will reveal the truth about Donald Trump. The rest of the world will know. Will the American people know the truth? I doubt it. Story 179. I hope that when he dies, someone can figure out how to remove his name, likeness, and memory from United States history. Story 180. We are going to withhold his name and share the cautionary tale of what happens when a fascist pedophile is elected by uneducated racist bigots. We are all tired of hearing his name and do not want his influence to continue. Hopefully, his congestive heart failure resolves the problem within the next 6 to 8 months or sooner. Story 181. The greatest con man to ever live. But they will not study his art. Instead, they will study the brains of the believers, looking for some type of brain dysfunction or chronic traumatic encephalopathy that they all suffered from, or some type of enzyme deficiency. Story 182. He was the president the country deserved. Also, books in America? Laugh out loud. Story 183. Hard to say. Like any other conservative president, probably like Reagan or Jackson. In the unlikely event he dies in office, maybe his vice president will not be noteworthy. All the allegations and court cases pertaining to Donald Trump's personal and financial affairs will be a footnote. Story 184. In 50 years, we will not have history books, only elders telling stories of the past and traveling sock puppet theater troupe reenactments. Story 185. They will be baffled by how nearly every institution failed to prevent this. Story 186. I think history books will see Donald Trump as a polarizing figure who reshaped politics and media, for better or worse. Future generations might debate whether he was a catalyst for change or a step backward. Story 187. Look at this man. Hopefully, it brings attention to how terrible he and all of his followers are, and how he is practically Hitler too. Story 188. I really doubt it. He is not the first terrible president. I do not hear much criticism in history books or reports about previous presidents who performed poorly. He will probably be remembered only by trivia enthusiasts. Story 189. Look what they are doing to education. Do you think people will be reading in 50 years? Story 190. At that point, we will have been a dictatorship for 50 years. No one will remember that our republic, which lasted for almost 300 years with checks and balances, fell to a petty con man and his cronies. If you believe this will all go away in 2028, you are delusional. This is their legacy. Those of you who did not vote allowed this to happen. There is no going back from this. You non-voters destroyed our republic and what was the great ideal set by the founding fathers. Thank you for that. Enjoy your brave new world. Story 191. History books will be banned by the end of this administration. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.